Thank you everyone for joining for our weekly seminar. Today we have Dr. Paul Robbins from University of Wisconsin, where he's going to give a talk titled Return of the Repressed, Native Presence in American Memory in John Muir's Boyhood and Youth. So Dr. Robbins has years of experience as a researcher and educator, and he specializes in human interactions with nature and politics, in the politics of natural resource management. His research addresses questions spanning conservation conflicts, urban ecology, and environment and health interactions. He's done extensive field work in rural India, where he's focused his work on the politics surrounding forestry and wildlife conservation, as well as more recent research examining the wealth of biodiversity in commercial coffee and rubber plantations. He has led studies on consumer chemical risk behaviors, mosquito management, and elk management in the United States. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Robbins to start his talk.
Awesome. Thank you. My computer's telling me I have an unstable connection. So when I disappear, think well of me and give me a minute or two to get back. It's really nice to be invited. I'm sorry I'm not up there with you. It is one of my favorite trips to just take the long fall drive up to Minnesota. It's something I've treasured since I was quite young. So what a pain in the butt that we're all stuck in the basement. But here we are. Jim Perry has a lovely background. So we can imagine we're somewhere else. By way of introduction, I want to say that I was ready to talk about just about anything because I was honored to be invited to talk to conservation science communities all the time, being not a conservation scientist myself, but somebody who works closely with conservation biologists and also more recently with conservation geneticists. That's my new favorite thing. We could talk about that some other time. And I offered several topics, and which included recent work we have done on coffee, which shows the relationship between avian diversity, obviously, and the configuration of coffee, of the shade structure of coffee plantations, and then the political economy that determines farmer decisions. So that seemed like a much better fit for this group. You guys really want to save birds and stuff, but I threw out the Muir topic, and you bit. And I think that's interesting because maybe 2 years ago, had we had this conversation, that would have seemed like a, I don't know, kind of a side trip. But I think the events of the last 2 years have changed the tone in which our conversation about Muir happens. I am a reverent admirer of Muir and his work. I want to say that at the outset, and have read him since I was quite young. Certainly had a huge impact on my life. But nonetheless, I found myself puzzling over the last few years about a problem in our thinking, well predating the Sierra Club suddenly wringing its hands about John Muir. So what I want to be clear about is that we've known that John Muir said racist stuff and that he had a real peculiar relationship with Native history and presence on the land. We've known that for decades. It's very interesting that right now it is emergent. And I think that's part of what Sarah Moore, my co-author, and I want to wrestle with, is why is that so? So let me present the paper, and maybe we can have a little conversation about what it means that John Muir suddenly remembered Indians so late in his life, exactly the same way we're suddenly remembering a lot of things about our violent history. What does it mean for conservation? And I would say, without question, it's a good thing. Can everybody see? Are we good? Kyle? Okay, I'm getting a nod. Excellent. So there were times in the earlier part of this decade when I was thinking that my calling, my academic calling, now that I'm just basically a bureaucrat, was no longer relevant. That is that, that political ecology, which is which combines the concerns of ecology in the formal sense with a broadly defined political economy, where maybe it reached its limits. Maybe it was just like some hangover from 1990s political economy. Maybe I'm just getting old, but in the last decade or so, I've become a little more, or maybe last 5 years, I've become dissuaded of that position. I rather now feel that repressed memory and a memory of violence has to always revisit us, and that our current madness, and I don't think there's another word for it, is one that's rooted in American memory. And it's a violence from which this nation was born. And it's a violence that just when you think you've forgotten it, it sort of re-announces itself over and over, and often with a vengeance. And it's that violence whose forgetting, that is, the constant forgetting of the violence, causes the ruptures that we see in the present. And that makes it, I think, something that can only be described in the narrative form of what I'm calling political ecology. So I've rediscovered political ecology. And so what I want to briefly ask here is, what do you do with trauma like that? So my colleague and co-author, Sarah Moore, and I want to persuade you here by way of a detour into a conversation about Muir, who's so important to conservation history and his life and psyche, that we can only work through this problem, and we can't cure it unless we got the tools to name it. And that's where this book comes in. Do we have a vocabulary? Do we have a language to name what people are inhibited to name, to talk about things people don't want to talk about, for the repressed, for the unspoken? And what would it sound like if we did? What kind of trauma would we name with that kind of language? That's our question. It's a very difficult research question relative to one where it's like, how many birds are related to how many trees? An area I feel somewhat more comfortable. So how do we get at the answer to that for John Muir? And I'll try to puzzle through that here. So a long time before the Muir that we're all familiar with, for the most part, hiked in the Sierras and explored Alaska. The Alaska work, by the way, if you've not read it, is spectacular. And who courted Theodore Roosevelt. Before all that, he was a Scottish migrant to our neck of the woods here in the Minnesota-Wisconsin region. He settled with a migrant Scottish family in the 1840s in Marquette County. And his accounts of that settlement, his very earliest years and his first adventures, are recalled in this 1913 book. So it's a late book. It's very important. It's called The Story of My Boyhood and Youth, and I show it there. That book's interesting for a bunch of ways. First, it includes some hints about his relationship with his father, which were deeply problematic. And also a lot of loving descriptions of nature, you know, and not like the California mountains. What's so great about it is it's landscapes that, if you're in Minnesota and Wisconsin, are super familiar, flora and fauna that we all know. And so the childhood shows sort of the roots of this legendary observer of the natural world that we think of in this fairly prosaic agricultural landscape. It's a super cool, quick read. But more than this, Boyhood and Youth is notable for the ongoing mention of indigenous people. There are a lot of Indians in Boyhood and Youth. And not only are images and descriptions of Native Americans present throughout the whole book, they just don't go away, right? The word Indian appears 58 times in this. Really, it's a slim volume. It's essentially a long essay. Detailed accounts of Native practices and Indian life fill all the pages. Muir walks on Native trails, and he observes and describes Native hunting, and he describes Native landmarks. So Indians are everywhere in the Wisconsin of his early years. Now, what's interesting about that is that, of course, John Muir has been criticized by me and lots of other people for his deafening silence on the role of Native people in occupying and foraging and tending all the environments that he so often described as wilderness. This is not a fresh critique. It's sort of part of the staple of complaining about Muir. His work, when acknowledging or even lamenting the status of Native peoples, is also marked by the absence of any kind of reflection on their elimination, how they evacuated the areas that he's describing in California in particular, where the genocide was profound, extensive, and almost perfect. So at times describing a respect for Native practices, and you see that in the Alaska work, by the way, which I would send you to. He's definitely engaging and thinking about natives there a little. Muir really rarely actually mentions so much as a conversation with an Indian. In all that work, you don't actually hear a single Indian voice. And when he describes them as, and these are direct quotes, dirty, deadly, and lazy. And those was a reference. Those words were in reference to the Miwok communities of Yosemite. I don't know if you've been to Yosemite, but it was inhabited back before it was a place that you climbed rocks. So neither are Native peoples commonly described by Muir as major actors, like forging the land. And he says they had, quote, no right place in the landscape of wild California. That's a mid-Muir, 1894. In Ross Wakefield's words, quote, the pedestal of John Muir's nature was too high for the Indian to attain. So I'm just reinforcing what we already know. He had a kind of awkward relationship, awkward is polite, with Native Americans. And none of this is unique to Muir, right? The divine manuscript of Yosemite's landscape, in Muir's words, from which Muir sought to find these lessons, was one that was fashioned by God, right? Not by people. And that's really important. If you populated these landscapes, you'd have to explain how they became the way they did. You'd need an environmental history that's considerably different than the transcendental one that he was describing. So that was real common in the 19th century. Muir was not some kind of exception here. But given the absence of Indians in all of other Muir's work, why do they so pop out in Boyhood and Youth? And Boyhood and Youth was shoved into my hands by my colleague Jack Kloppenberg right after I got back here about 8 years ago. I went to school here in Madison back in the 1980s. And I read it because I like Muir and I'd never read this book. And damn, there's just Indians all over the page. And it really jumped out at me and really felt like a Wisconsin story worth telling. So what we're going to do here, if you'll forgive the theory, is we're going to employ what we call a symptomatic reading. That's a psychoanalytic language to the experiences of boyhood and youth, to argue that Native presence in this specific book, not everything, but in this book, among his last writings, represents the return of repressed memory. And we don't mean simply Muir's repressed memory. We mean the repressed memory of the American people, which makes possible the national park system and is the contradiction upon which most American conservation is founded. You have to repress the memory. We also argue, and we'll say later, that no memory can be repressed forever, and it always comes back. And how it reannounces itself gives you the problematic lives that you live in the present, which I believe is the present of 2020. So from the outset, it's super clear that Native presence in Boyhood and Youth is filled with Indians. I'm going to try to make that point really quickly and then talk about what that might mean, if that's cool with you. So coming in this early wave of Northern European farmers from native Scotland, right? Muir's Scottish, he's coming with his family. About the same time, we got a lot of Scandinavian settlers on the land here in Wisconsin, Irish, English. These settler colonists entered a landscape that had only recently been wrested from Native peoples, specifically at the time called the Winnebago, that's our current Ho-Chunk tribes, and the Menominee tribe. The settlement here, you can see in the map, is just north of Portage. This is Fountain Lake. It's now called Ennis Lake. Just north of Portage, which falls within the land ceded from the Ho-Chunk in 1829. That's just adjacent to lands the Ho-Chunk ceded in 1837, ceded by treaties that were found in the 1970s, by the way, to be illegal and unjustified. And that finding allowed the Ho-Chunk to reclaim land in Wisconsin. And there, the Menominee in 1848. So that's just 1 year before the Muirs settle, 1848. So it's not like 50 years. It's literally last year. The Menominee have been removed from the land. A word about Portage and this area, which I think is important to this story. You can't see my cursor probably, right? Or you can? Okay, so Portage is here. Portage, so Muir Homestead is just north of here. A little geography about Portage. Portage you could think of as the New York City, the Grand Central Station of the upper Midwest. If you never heard of it, you should have. If you got in a canoe and came up the St. Lawrence Seaway, found your way into the Great Lakes, entered Green Bay, came up the Fox River through the Winnebago, then came up the Fox River out of the Winnebago into Ho-Chunk country, you could then descend the Wisconsin River here into the Mississippi and go all the way to the Gulf of Mexico without setting your foot on dry land except in one place in North America. Portage. Portage, that's how it gets its name. It is the place between the waters. It's right there at this really incredibly important ecotone as well. And it was the crossroads of civilization. There were lots of native tribes that met in Portage. The French were there long before Scots settlers. It was a very exciting cosmopolitan native place. Lots of activity, right? So he settled right essentially into this really exciting native site that had just been wrested from native peoples in the point thereafter. So finding Indians in the book shouldn't be all that friggin' surprising, right? If you grew up in Wisconsin, in Portage, even after all that land had been given away and the forced removals were coming upon these people, which I'll mention in a moment, it's not surprising you'd see Indians. Muir in the book and his brother, they ramble down, and these are their words, Indian trails, and they interact with farmers of Indian corn and encounter Indian ponies and Indian mounds. This is right in the middle of mound country here. Indian moccasin, Indian wigwams, Indian is everywhere. Most facets of the landscape, except for a few imposed by European architectural history, get that adjective. The adjective is Indian. As to the presence of native peoples themselves, the book provides some contradictory images. On several occasions, native hunters are described in action spearing muskrat in a way that Muir clearly is impressed by. And these descriptions are familiar from other work. He had a very strong sense that native knowledge, indigenous knowledge, was important and relevant. But far more commonly, the Indians in boyhood and youth in this book are hungry beggars and they're thieves. They are a lurking present, marauding Indians, doing all kinds of criminal stuff like herding pigs. And the theft of Muir's horse is a really telling one. This is a fairly well-known piece from the book. Muir writes, when the Indian tried to sell her to the farmer, that is, somebody has allegedly stolen a horse, the farmer says, actually, you stole that horse from me. And the Indian says, no, I bought her in Prairie du Chien, and she's always been mine. You are lying. I will take that horse away from you and put her in my pasture. And if you come near it, I will set the dogs on you. That comes from boyhood and youth. But the most important invocation of natives comes towards the end of the book, and it's a very important passage when Muir describes a very spirited debate between his father and a neighbor named Mr. Meyer, M-A-I-R, another Scot, debating the justification for removing Indians from the land in the first place. Like, what right do we have to take these people off the land? They're actually debating it in the book. Muir's not debating it. He's describing a debate between his dad and a neighbor. And remember, he hates his dad, okay? So Meyer, the neighbor, describes it as, and I'll quote here, that it's pitiful to see how the unfortunate Indians, children of nature, living on the natural products of the soil, hunting, fishing, and even cultivating small cornfields on the most fertile spots, were now being robbed of their lands and being pushed ruthlessly back into narrower and narrower limits by alien races who were cutting off their means of livelihood, unquote. So that's Muir quoting Meyer the neighbor in defense of natives and against the justification for their removal. Now, Muir's father, in response in this conversation in the book, responds that it could not have possibly been the divine intention for Indians to rove across the landscape and, quote, hold it forever in unproductive wildness, while Scotch and Irish and English farmers could put it to so much better use. Where an Indian requires thousands of acres for his family, these acres in the hands of industrious, God-fearing farmers would support 10 or 100 times more people. And Meyer then responds to Muir, that is to the father, by saying, well-trained farmers could farm the land probably way more productively than you and me, buddy. Untrained, unskilled settlers like Muir and Meyer, us, in other words, were really the unproductive ones in relative terms to the Europeans. So did God, he concluded in the argument, intend for them to be put off the land as well? By justification of the productivity to which it could be put, right? And young Muir concludes at the end of this really fascinating exchange that Meyer had the better side of the argument, right? That his dad was wrong, and goes on to make a sort of general question about the welfare of others. But I think he's making an argument also about the problems of a productivist imagination, right? You can see the value of wilderness sort of hidden in here. There's hints of a lot of other things in the book, but it's not hard to detect through the repeated haunting presence of Indians that I've tried to document here really briefly, that There's a combination of fear and fear of violence, but also injustice on the landscape. He's wrestling with this stuff. Hunger, theft. There's a moral dialogue over the productivist imagination of colonial settlement versus the wild. In short, Indians really aren't some part of boyhood and youth. This book is about Indians. It's about Native peoples. So this last exchange, let's see if I can't bring that up, on God's intentions for the land also marks the very final appearance of Native Americans in the book. And as it turns out, right, it's the last time Indians appear in anything John Muir ever wrote. The work reached print in 1912 for the Atlantic Monthly. I'll say a word about how it was written. And was published in 1913 by Houghton Mifflin. And Muir would be dead in less than a year. So this was like, this is it. This is late final, this is deathbed Muir. The work, in a sense then, right, is his final reflection, even though, right, it's recording his earliest memories. His last book was about his first memories. So that Native Americans, who've been so absent in all of his work, would return in such full force in this late reflection. Sarah and I argue in the paper at greater length, it's just not a coincidence. This is a final reconciliation which writes Native Americans back into the very foundational landscape of Muir's life, that Wisconsin Midwest childhood. And we suggest that it is a case of repressed memory and experience, one that Muir had heretofore, in his devotion to wilderness preservation, right, repeated. And we further suggest that this reflects a larger trauma, not of Muir, but played out by all white settlers of the period in which and after which we created conservation. And happily, conservation science, to which you are all, I am pleased to say, committed practitioners. So by repressed, and we use that word very intentionally, so I'm going to take you down a little bit of Lacanian theory, hang in there. We mean a thought in your head and its attendant affects and emotions, the things it makes you feel, that are too painful to entertain in the conscious mind, or at least keep there very long. You've all had them, whether you admit it or not. And so they are driven into the unconscious of the subject. Now, this defensive strategy, as it's called, is always an incomplete process, and it's got disturbing ramifications. The repressed always returns. Like, it's convenient to repress things that are hard to compute, but this only creates all kinds of disjunctures in your conscious experience. The trauma, and this is Freud, do I have a quote here? Here we go. The trauma is characterized by the return of repressed memories, therefore, by the failure of the defense being taking the things you can't think about without having trouble and putting them into the unconscious. The reactivated memories and the self-reproaches formed from them never reemerge unchanged. They come back, but they never come back the same way they went down. They reemerge jaggedly. And there's some really interesting, like, I know Freud seems really dated to you people, but there's some interesting stuff about school shootings we can talk about in the Q&A, about what people remember and what people don't, which really puts the finger on this phenomena in the mind of a human being. So I won't go through the rest of this, just to say that whatever comes back, the self-reproaches never reemerge unchanged. What comes up instead are obsessions of various kinds, fixations of the mind, right? Things that you want to do over and over again, a repetitious compulsion, sometimes generative of really great outcomes, and sometimes really screwed up, right? Which is why you seek therapy. So rather than dwell on Muir's individual psyche, which we're not especially interested in, we want to talk about American society more generally and settler colonialism and conservation as a result of this. The specific overlooked memory, obviously, that we're talking about that is haunting Muir and which returns in boyhood and youth, right, is a pretty material and really recent. It's the genocide of Native peoples, right? Not rocket surgery. The lands on which the Muirs settled in 1849 were ones whose final fate was settled actually in a short little history now, violent, decisive war waged about 12 years earlier, about a decade earlier. Many of you are from Minnesota and Wisconsin. Some of you are not. Drive down the Mississippi River, not very far, near La Crosse, and I can show you the location that I will describe in just a moment. In 1832, the Sauk leader, Black Hawk, crossed the Mississippi into Illinois from Iowa Indian Territory with a number of Sauk and Kickapoo to settle lands that had been set aside by treaty, but then they were forced off of. And the conflict that ensued had a lot of pitched battles. It was really messy. There were a lot of massacres, a lot of rambling across Wisconsin, and then a final battle at a place called Bad Axe, which is memorialized by a very disturbing sign. And it's near present-day Victory, Wisconsin, which is just south of La Crosse. And it's named Victory, so named because as many as 600 Native warriors and non-combatants, women and children, were murdered and massacred. There was a gunboat on the river. It's a site of essentially the last armed resistance to white settlement east of the Mississippi prior to, obviously, the wars in Sioux territory that would follow. And this is then followed by a very ragged retreat, ending in Black Hawk's surrender and the death of most of his warriors. Most of the people who were killed at Bad Axe, by the way, were women and children. The whole thing is memorialized, again, on this great big rock, but we've got one on UW campus as well that's dedicated to Black Hawk from the class of 1920-something. Super strange, like, what's up with that? So the conflict itself, the war, has got its own history. There's good books on it. It's notable because Captain Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis both served in the conflict for the U.S. Army. The war's native geopolitics were also super complicated. The Ho-Chunk sided with Black Hawk, but the Menominee sided with the Europeans. I mean, there's a lot of blood on all hands, but it's definitely a product of white settler colonialism. But the upshot is that the 1832 conflict was the end of that war. And from there on, Indians would be moved off the land. And this is a decade before the Muirs settled. So genocide, hunger, thievery, all the things that appear in his book, are the aftermath essentially of a genocidal forced removal of a population that he's observing in real time, right? So again, what does it mean for these Native people to reappear so forcefully in Muir's memory precisely at the end of his life? Why do they reappear here in Wisconsin? Why didn't they reappear in Yosemite or the Sierra or any of the other places that he was writing? We fall on another theorist here. I don't want to go too far down that road, but the theory that comes from Lacanian psychoanalysis, which follows from Muir, hang in with me, folks, is that the realm of experience and the realm of what you imagine, that is the thing you're repressing, come into conflict, which creates traumatic experience. And as I suggested before, repetitive compulsion to solve problems and conflicts. And in evidence of this, I want to say that in a late essay, a brief essay that he writes that I found in putting this work together, Muir tries to describe the writing of this book, Boyhood and Youth, as being really difficult. It was super hard for him to write. These Indians could not appear in the Sierras. They couldn't appear in Yosemite. They are repressed memory, right? Invited by his patron, Edward Harriman, to join him in the Pelican Bay Lodge at Klamath Lake in Oregon, which is where he intended to do this writing, Muir repeatedly experiences writer's block, which he's never had in his whole life. He has it writing this book, can't write it. So Harriman provides Muir with a stenographer who follows Muir around Pelican Bay for days and days. And all Muir does is talk. And the stenographer writes it all down. And this so-called Pelican Bay manuscript actually doesn't look all that much like the final book, by the way, and it's worth looking at. You can find it online. It's just been archived. But it's Muir trying to speak this thing. And these reflections, added after the fact, become the book that we all have access to, Boyhood and Youth. It is not very difficult for even a lazy psychoanalyst like me to conclude that the struggle to write Boyhood and Youth reflects the return of repressed memory. Right? It is to speak the unspeakable. So, and I'm getting to the end here. We could talk a little bit about what this means for conservation. Does all this tangled history, this messiness of forgetting and then remembering, defeat the possibility of learning and reconciliation? I don't think so, because the repetitive compulsion that we're describing, I want to be super clear, the mutation of the repressed memory of Native genocide is the park system. right? I mean, it is conservation. Conservation is the imperfect announcement of an attempt to reconcile imperfectly with American history and genocide, at least for Muir. And that's why it comes late, and that's why it comes hard. Does Muir learn anything over the course of his entire career about Indians? Yeah, he sure does. So this is from Fleck, a really great historian. Muir's vital contact with American Indians definitely enriched his spiritual experience and informed a lot of his conservation efforts. There is a myth that Muir was named an honorary chief of the Tlingit people in Alaska. That's been totally debunked. I won't drag you down there. Like, worst kind of white man fantasy, I'm an Indian. Worse yet, I'm an Indian chief. But there's no question that the desire to make that true comes out of a genuine respect that Muir gained over his life for Native peoples. So there's a reconciliation that happens over his career. And even so, I would say that there's a Freudian slip. Muir's late revelations of the landscape of violence, right, that you're seeing in this book, in the wake of the Black Hawk War, in the rush of all these white people onto the land, his final work suggests that, you never can really fully reconcile it, even though he did definitely address Native Americans, I think, in a more productive way at the end of his career than the beginning. So in other words, I think reconciliation is possible, but I think it was impossible for Muir because I don't think he was ready in a way that we need to be ready to look at the relationship between conservation and genocide, right? So I want to make two critical points and finish. And I'm good here, I got plenty of time. First, the genocide of Native Americans visited its premier trauma not on white folks. So I'm making the argument that this is an American white settler trauma. Obviously, the greater trauma is experienced by Native communities. Heightened suicide rates, poverty, struggle for sovereignty, that's a daily inheritance of this violence, which many people in the medical and historical community suggest literally embody themselves in the health patterns of Native peoples. So that's one thing I'd argue. But as the second thing I'd argue is, right, that Native people never went away just because they were forced off the land and they've been rendered historical and they've been forgotten. The Ho-Chunk never left. The Ho-Chunk people, once they ceded that territory illegally, were moved first to Minnesota, into the Dakotas, and then to Nebraska, where the Winnebago tribe still exists today. But they didn't go away. They returned every time on foot, by rail, later, by canoe. The Ho-Chunk people are here in force today and hold a significant amount of land. Specifically, they hold about 9,000 acres scattered across about 20 counties, but that's only after, as I said, a 1974 Indian Claims Commission found them to be tribes of fraudulent treaties. And the Menominee, who were right next door, right? The Muir settled right between these two tribes, now hold about 200,000 acres, but that was only after this really harrowing period between 1961 and 1973, where they were actually denied tribal status and the land taken away. So I'm saying that the return of actual people, real living Ho-Chunk people and their descendants, and the return of land and the return of violent memory are intertwined in the Wisconsin landscape and definitely in the Minnesota landscape. And to name that is the crucial step for coming to terms with it in a way that we can do conservation on this land with these communities. So, and here you see Native holdings in the state of Wisconsin. You can see the Ho-Chunk are scattered around. Most of the land has been acquired. They've had to buy it back. They are federally recognized, and that is reservation land, but it is not federal reservation. They have a very complicated status under federal law. So decades into this experiment that I'm calling political ecology, I'm closing here, I think it's pretty fair to ask ourselves, like, what good is this kind of work? Everything I just did, does that help you do conservation, or does it make it harder? Or more to the point, does making it harder help it? Does knowing this in any way, our tendency to forget, our ability to remember, and the problem that remembering always causes a rupture that may lead to very misguided kinds of practices, certain forms of restoration, certain ideas about the pristinity of nature. I don't know. That's something that I guess I ask conservationists, my brothers and sisters in the science, especially in restoration ecology, some of my favorite practitioners. But more generally, so that's the first question. What does this mean for conservation? Maybe nothing, I don't know, probably something. And my second question is more general. It's really about all of us, I guess, in the United States, or me as a settler, colonial recent descendant of refugees from Russia and Italy. If we're trying to reconcile ourselves with the history of this very tormented landscape that I live literally on, I'm at the top of a hill, a Ho-Chunk hill, talking to you right now. How do we come up with vocabulary to talk about it in a way that is productive, especially productive with dialogue with the Native communities that the University of Wisconsin, I cannot speak for the University of Minnesota, is working fairly hard for the first time in its entire history to attempt to do? What is the language that can reconcile it? And I'm pretty sure this isn't it, but this is the sign that we have. This bronze marker is up on Bascom Hill, not right now because there's construction. It took 2 to 3 years of negotiation with the Ho-Chunk tribe to come up with the language on this sign. And it's the most tormented language of its own kind, but it still is quite revolutionary. And it's also the only bronze marker in the series, and there are a series of these for those of you who visited. This is the official Bascom Hill district that contains not only the Numen Lumen of the university, but the Great Seal of the Ho-Chunk people, that acknowledges that the land that we're sitting on, that I'm sitting on right now, is called Dejope, a place that the Ho-Chunk has called Dejope forever, and that these lands were ceded by territory by treaty in 1832 forcibly, and that ethnic cleansing followed. I couldn't get the word genocide on there. I talked to the chancellor at some length. And that history of colonization informs whatever relationship we're going to have, especially around conservation, which is of acute interest to the Ho-Chunk and the Menominee people. So that is where I'm going to leave it. 3 questions that are 3 lessons, right? We forget genocide until we remember it. It never comes back the same way, and it tends to come back as conservation. That's our argument. That's my reading of this strange book. Thanks to Jack Kloppenberg for putting in my hands 8 years ago. I would take questions or answers to any of the questions I myself have posed. Oh, also, how many of us are there? We're 47, so I think the Q&A they've recommended, Kyle and Nick recommend that you put it in, you type it in the chat if you have any questions. Nick?
Yeah,
Kyle, that good?
Yeah, that works. And I just wanted to say, I hope everyone agrees with me. That was an excellent presentation, and give you a nice silent round of applause because it was very interesting. So if people want to go ahead and enter in the chat box questions, and I can read them out to Dr. Robbins.
Welcome. Oh my God. So the question, everybody can see this, but Francie Cuthbert discussed Muir in environmental ethics and natural resources class, and would like a suggestion of a paper or chapter to recommend as reading for undergraduates that includes a critical discussion of Muir's relationship with Native Americans. It can only be something you or others have written. This one is fine. You just skip the Freud and you'd be fine. But I think a little spoonful of Freud is good for you. Leaving that aside, actually, Imposing Wilderness is one of the great single volumes on Native histories and conservation. I believe that's the name of it. I can't believe I've forgotten the name of one of the most important books. What's interesting is that's a whole book, but even the introduction or the first chapter or 2 is very, very readable. And it simply argues that, yeah, wilderness used to be populated and it had to be depopulated to make it wilderness. And what are we going to do about that? it doesn't have nearly the theoretical baggage that I carry to my conversation, although I do recommend our article. So I think, Nick, can you look up Imposing Wilderness and make sure I got the name right and the author? It's terrific. And there's so few full volume treatments of this question that it's heartbreaking. You know, like you think there'd be a lot more. I want to say something further though, that when it comes to actual current native populations and their relationship with Federal Reserve on Park Service land, it's really actually a very strong relationship, even with the BLM and others. So it's not like this is exactly a war, right? Native peoples prefer to have the federal government running these properties than the people who are building pipelines. It's a very practical community solution. That doesn't mean that they're happy about everything. The Apostle Islands, which is not far from you, closer to you than it is to me. I don't know how many of you have ever been there. Gaylord Nelson's great legacy talked John Kennedy into that Federal Reserve. The Red Cliff people who live next door they're still upset, right? That's sacred Red Cliff land. So Gaylord Nelson's name isn't that great up there in Red Cliff country. So it's a fraught relationship. Imposing Wilderness, I believe, is the name of it. Nick, did I get it right? Okay, look it up.
I think so.
Is not the National Public National Park Service in its founding not a return of the repressed, but the active wilderness preservation effort to check the loss of frontier and wave modern industrial civilization that was feared sapping from the male Nordic American vigor and stamina, not a reaction to genocide. Okay. Joseph Bump's question is awesome. And now we're ready to have a seminar on psychoanalysis. So that's an interesting counter hypothesis. What I would suggest, and I wish Sarah was here because she's the Lacanian, not me, right? I'm just a sad Marxist. But I think that what Sarah would argue is it announces itself as Nordic American vigor, a point about which Aldo Leopold himself also made claims. Nordic vigor, right? I would argue, and maybe you're smarter than I am, that is precisely not what it's about. It announces itself as being about that, right? Because of course, the problem lies in this prior genocide, and it announces itself in this way. So, but I'm willing to accept that as a counter hypothesis. But it's still repressed memory, and they're tied up, right? Masculinization and emasculinization, to be emasculated, is pretty fundamental to most Lacanian and Freudian announcements of the subconscious. That relationship to guilt and genocide, those could be a very complicated cocktail, which sounds a whole lot like, can I say something? Like the current administration. Okay, so there I said it. I'm not allowed to say that. I'm a dean. Literally, if the chancellor heard me say that, I would be fired. So it's good this is being recorded. Anyway, Joseph, I think that there's a complicated relationship here, and I think you've named something important that I wouldn't discount at all. I don't know. What do you think? You want to weigh in further? You're on. I can see you. You're muted, though.
No, I appreciate the feedback. It's a little out of my wheelhouse, but yeah, I don't know how to distinguish in the inception the difference kind of between those two competing ideas. I think in the current practice, what you're saying makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's kind of complicated. I just think those things are together. It's interesting, right, that white Nordic vigor is really about reclaiming land now from the federal government. That is right. To which, so it's so interesting, right? When they held that federal land a couple years back, and they called on help from Native people, saying, "Don't you want your land back?" The local Native communities, and Emma Maris has written on this. I'm not an expert. Said, "No, we prefer the feds have it than you." That might have just been a practical political decision and nothing to do with psychoanalysis. It's a great question, though, man. You're on the right track. Anytime you talk about emasculinization, nature, conservation, you're there. We need more psychoanalysis, not less. I'm sorry, but I can't recall if you said whether or not you and your co-author have tried to discuss your theories or points of view on this topic with any Native people. Yes, we have. We didn't say so. So I have given versions of this to audiences containing Native scholars and local Native people. And this is where the biggest critique I got in early versions of this was that there's a tendency in the way it was written in its first round to historicize Native presence as if they were gone, which was of course not the point, right? In my mind, the point was they're all still here. I mean, Wisconsin's populated by lots of Native people, and that I reinstantiated a kind of erasure. That was, and I thought that was a really useful critique, because in fact, it's possible that I did. That in the drafts I was writing, I was repeating precisely the crime that I'm critiquing. And there's two things to say about that. One, it improved later drafts, that's for sure. And my colleague Kim Dahlbehr has seen this and has said, not bad for a white guy. Well, it's high praise from Kim. But more to the point, I think I have to ask the question if it's true that I myself cannot write my way to writing Native people as part of the history of Muir's history, and that in the habit of erasure is even deeper than we think. The second piece that I want to stress is that in my conversations with, again, Native scholars, the ho-chunk that we work with around here, I haven't put this paper in front of the folks who are doing restoration ecology, but it informs the way I hope we interact. But the second point, it seemed really important a moment ago. Let's come back to it. One is the repetition of erasure. There is another piece to this. I'll come back. Oh, it's really important that I assert, claim, and police myself over the following question. Who am I writing about? I am writing about John Muir. I am not writing about Native Americans. And I say that because that comes out of my own conversation with Native scholars. I need to account for the white imagination as it's practiced in conservation by people like me. And Muir, if Muir isn't like super important to how that happens in your childhood or in college or whatever, then you weren't like me. Muir is important. And if we don't understand Muir symptomatically, we can't understand ourselves symptomatically. And that also came out of my conversations with Native scholars. So that, I mean, that's the answer, is that there is some interaction here. Have we gone on the ground with our partners for, you know, the land that we work with and burn and are attempting to restore at several sites around the state? No, this argument didn't for that audience. And besides, I'm talking to white folks like me. Native peoples aren't very surprised that people have forgotten about genocide. So that, I guess that's the answer. And Caroline, it's a really good question. Yeah, all right. Do you see your lessons, the three you listed at the end of your talk, being exportable outside of your region in North America? I work in India. That's the funny thing, which has got its own colonial problem. It's a great question. That's Jessica. And the answer
also,
is,
Paul, if it,
yeah.
if it is very particular and specific to Muir's experience, and then you're extrapolating that, does that apply elsewhere in North America? But I also love your question about what does it mean for how we interpret conservation outside of North America too? Yeah,
so to be super clear, the technique, the Lacanian technique, when you read these texts, is that you are reading for a social effect, not for an individual one. I mean, I said we're writing about Muir, but we're really writing about American conservation. And we're reading one as the other because it's a pretty easy, you know, it's a pretty easy connection to make. I think it's a fair one. It's not perfect. And the Lacanian approach, the psychoanalytic approach, is an N of one. What do we understand about the universal from that one dude on the couch? That might not be science in people who study avian behavior, but it is for a good Lacanian. So yes, this is the North American conservation experience. I would say it is. Now, there are other psychoses related to conservation that are different than the Native American question. I listened to Midia Ponte last night talking about Latino heritage and the Park Service. It was a really interesting talk. She's really good if you've not seen her stuff. And they've got a really different relationship with the history of the Park Service and, right, and the settlement of the Southwest and, you know, the urban populations of the Northeast. And if you just exported the reading of Muir and you plopped it on top of that, you'd be making a mistake. That needs another kind of reading, and that's okay. To be fair, the only thing that this essay actually is attempting to do is explain why there are so damn many Native Americans in one book. In the end, that is actually the empirical question. How did they get there? And the answer, right, is that, well, you have to force them to go away. So, but that seems to me to be pretty typical of our entire white settler or settlement history. So that's the answer. The international question, no, I think you can't read colonial Britain without reading a really different psychoanalytic reading. You'd need a different text, but I think the technique, I think there's a methodology here that is useful. And let me tell you something, until I met Sarah and heard her work and then talked to her colleagues in psychoanalytic theory, I would never have thought to use this method. I would have said, that's just a bridge too far for me. You know, like, let me count, let me show how money makes things happen. That's like how primitive I am. It has been transformational to work with psychoanalytic theorists because what they're offering is a method. You can't just take your reading of Muir and plant it in Ranthambore or Bharatpur, but you can ask what the psychosexual relationship is between colonial actors at the period that Bharatpur was created as a bird sanctuary and the Raja at the time. I think that's a reasonable question. It would tell us a lot about what birds you get there.
Thank you. It's nice to see you too.
It's nice to see you. I haven't seen, I know. Hi. Yeah, Nick Phelps. Oh, there's the article. Yeah, it's not all that different than what I put here. Let me ask a further question because it looks like we're out of other people's questions. There's two questions I have. One was the other one. What does this mean for conservation as a scientific practice? I would love somebody to tell me that because I don't know. And the second one is, what's up with now? My hypothesis is if I'd offered you this topic 2 or 3 years ago when I started on this journey, it must have been at least 3 years ago when we started doing this work, you just said, we'd like to hear about the coffee plantations. Muir seems a little dated. When I gave this presentation in La Crosse a couple of years ago at a geography meeting, mostly graduate students, they said, they're given anonymous comments on the talk. And they said, we don't want to hear about stuff that happened a long time ago. We want to solve problems now. They're graduate students in conservation. I understand that. I disagree with it. Otherwise, I wouldn't have done this work. But I bet if I had given the same presentation right now, I wouldn't have gotten the same comments. And that's not because I changed. What has happened? What has happened in the last year and a half? That the Sierra Club is suddenly wants to read Imposing Wilderness because they didn't before. In the late 90s, I remember they argued for immigration control, for God's sake. I was there, I remember. It's the dialogue has totally changed. That's interesting to me. If anybody's got a theory, if the answer might just be George Floyd, I don't know.
I'll pipe in because no one else is asking questions. I think it is George Floyd has raised awareness more broadly. And we're seeing things like bird names for birds is a movement now. Let's stop naming common names of North American birds for despicable historical characters, or even if they're not despicable. We don't need to name them after white Europeans.
I missed a lot of that because my internet froze, but if there is a movement to change the naming conventions of birds so that we re-examine race history in this country, that sounds like a pretty good idea.
That is indeed happening.
So why? Why now? Why not 10 years ago? I don't know. But it's, I think whatever you name them, and it's never going to be satisfactory, but the very exercise of thinking about it is revolutionary for conservation and ornithology, I think. That's really exciting, Todd. I hadn't heard that. Oh, I know the Brahminy kite. Yeah, I know the Brahminy kite. Sorry, it's in the chat. You bet. I'm not a South Asianist for nothing. Yeah. Well, place names have long been under that kind of scrutiny. There's like 5 squaw peaks in Arizona when I got there. I used to teach at the University of Arizona, and when I left, there were 3, which is interesting. And we're working a little bit on signage and place names here on our own campus. And you never get it right. I mean, you can't undo, you can't, unless you give everybody back the land. I mean, that's real decolonization. Just give it back to the Ho-Chunk. Give them the university. Short of that, it'll never be enough. But the naming process has been very interesting. And that we work very closely with our native partners. Like, what do you want on these signs? What should we rename? They don't all agree. There's a lot of native politics that I don't understand. Yeah, causes, demands, one to identify motivation and conservation, e.g. hope and guilt. Yeah, I think that's really, actually, Joseph just added this question about hope and guilt. Yeah, I think that's right. I would say it's a deeper mechanism, a deeper dysfunction, but it is in the end, hope and guilt are what conservation is about. So of course it needs psychoanalysis. Conservationists, like what they're doing is a form of reparative therapy on themselves. So the least you could do, if that's what you're gonna do, that's the answer for conservation science. The least you could do is if you admit what you're doing, what I'm doing as a conservationist, as a restoration ecology fan, is actually trying to atone so I can have hope. Then let's get at the bottom of it. Let's not just stop there and say, I'm doing a good thing. Doing a good deed. Like really understanding where that comes from seems critical. COVID-19 has been important because it has given us time alone to reflect on George Floyd and other events. Over my pay grade. Great theory. Todd, I like your theory. Nothing like time alone. I've never done hard time. I have some colleagues who have. Nobody comes out the same as they went in. Do you think bridging gaps between indigenous people and restoration ecology in India is much wider than the US because of language and caste issues? It could be hard to get much wider than American genocide. So plenty of violence in India, intercaste violence that I could tell you stories about having a research assistant back in the 1990s who came from a leatherworking caste. He was working on a PhD, first one in his community, couldn't step across the door of the people, the farmers we were interviewing to talk about their forests. Couldn't even step across the doorway. So everybody has their own violence. So, I mean, Shavona's question is really good. I'm just proposing a method that can help be used along with everything else, which is inclusive practices, listening closely to communities, recognizing caste violence as part of the conservation landscape. We used to call that political ecology. So I would recommend political ecology. Okay, join us next week, everybody. There's more conservation to come. When this is all over, invite me back. I would love to be back in Minneapolis and hear what you all are working on. Cool. Thank you all very much. Good luck in your work. Do good work. Thanks.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say one more time from everyone that in our seminar today, we all wanted to send you a thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. I'm so glad to be here. If you have any idea what I do the rest of the day, you'll know what a joy it was to be with you. Not just because you're awesome. Bye, everybody.
All right, thank you.